Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche Organization for May 6th. Today's meeting, Man or Beast, British Cognitive Warfare on Humanity, or an International Harmony of Interests. Before we go to today's presentations, on this day of the coronation of King Charles, a date which will live in the minds of at least many in infamy, Helgazep LaRouche offered this suggestion of redemption to the newly coronated monarch. She said, "The heads of state who assembled this weekend for the coronation of King Charles can prove their commitment to freedom and democracy by congratulating the newly crowned king for making his first act the freedom of Julian Assange." We'll be saying more about the case of Julian Assange and the new king later on in our program. But what we want to do is to go right now to a recent write-up from our daily briefing regarding the central developments of the week. After the recent drone incident at the Kremlin, which Moscow has called a U.S.-backed attempt by Ukraine to assassinate President Vladimir Putin, the U.S. and Russia are on the verge of a shooting war with each other, at least according to Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov of Russia. He said, quote, "We are working on preventing a fall of our relations with the United States into the abyss of an open armed conflict. We're already on the verge of that abyss." He described officials in Washington as opponents and enemies of Russia due to what he called Russophobic policies being pursued in spite of the risks. Quote, "The anger and hatred towards Russia with which Washington acts in a situation in which it frankly should think of its own safety is inexplicable," he said. At the moment, quote, "no real diplomacy regarding the Ukraine conflict is possible between the two nations because the U.S., quote, has bet on further escalation," according to Ryabkov. Quote, "The U.S. has long been a direct participant in the conflict and has long been waging an open hybrid war against my nation." The Deputy Foreign Minister said that Washington tends to dismiss the statements of Russian officials, citing remarks made by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken regarding Russia's claim that Ukraine was behind the drone attack on the Kremlin. Quote, "I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt," Blinken told the Washington Post. Quote, "We leave it to Ukraine to decide how it is going to defend itself," he added. Kiev denies having any involvement in the attack on the Kremlin. Now, former CIA counterterrorism expert Larry Johnson had this to say about the drone incident.
"It came from Ukraine. The Russians were able to track the drones coming in, and that's why they were able to get off their air defense system to prevent those drones from actually impacting and blowing up the dome of the Kremlin. There was some fire on top of the drone, or on top of the dome, but that was a consequence of the debris that fell after the drone was destroyed. Why is Ukraine doing this now? It's pretty clear they did not consult with the United States in advance. I cannot believe that as stupid as Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley and Antony Blinken are, they're not that stupid, because they recognize this marks really a dramatic escalation. And I think that was Ukraine's intent, wanting to escalate it in a way to try to force the Russians to react that in a way that would then precipitate greater involvement by NATO and the United States. And I think they miscalculated on this. The reason they miscalculated is they failed to take into account that this week marks the 80, we're now 80 or 70, 78 years since the end of World War II. And Russia marks that occasion every year with millions of its citizens in the streets carrying signs bearing the pictures of their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents who served and in many cases died in the Great Patriotic War, as they refer to it. It has been, if you think about it, it was 81 years ago that you last had a fixed-wing aircraft with an explosive on board coming over Moscow. And that was during the final stages of the Nazis' failed attempt to take Moscow during their Operation Barbarossa. So this, militarily, this was inconsequential, tactically inconsequential. But symbolically, it stands right up there with, in the same way that the attack on Pearl Harbor did, or the attacks on 9/11, that it ends up enraging the population of Russia with that this would even be attempted. And just reading some of the comments by various members of the Duma, which is the Russian version of our Congress, of the U.S. Congress, they are livid. My favorite was one deputy who said, "This is no longer a red line, it's a stop line." So Medvedev, the former president and current chair of basically their National Security Council, noted that, Zelensky and all of his cabinet have now made themselves targets. Now, I don't think that the Russian general staff and Putin are going to react emotionally to this, but they're certainly going to use it to further galvanize support for the special military operation, and they will step up accordingly. The attacks on targets inside, military targets inside Ukraine. The Russians have been very judicious about avoiding civilian casualties. They're not out there trying to see how many civilians they can kill.
Helga LaRouche responded to both Johnson's analysis and the situation itself shortly after its occurrence on Wednesday.
This comes at a moment when, obviously there is a recognition that all this propaganda that Ukraine is winning, that Russia must lose the war on the battlefield, that is all not true. The leaks which came from, the Pentagon, which were published, over from January to April 8th until it was made public, I think. There is a very interesting interview which, our followers and viewers can look at. This is an interview done by Judge Napolitano with the former CIA agent Larry Johnson, who is part of the VIPs, the Veterans for Sanity in Intelligence. And, basically what Larry Johnson there says is that he has from sources, that's essentially the same underground network, or not underground, but, the network of military and intelligence people sitting in the institutions, in the military, in the intelligence services, who would have confirmed, who obviously fed also Seymour Hersh, who would basically have said that this comes from a general assessment that Ukraine is losing, and that the air defense of Ukraine is zero. And that the conclusion of both of it is that the United States and NATO are heading for a total catastrophe, and that is basically an effort to change course. And then, Judge Napolitano brings in footage from a Senate Arms and Services Committee hearing where Secretary of Defense Austin is testifying after, according to Larry Johnson, he knew about, this assessment, that basically the majority of majors and colonels and lieutenant colonels are absolutely horrified about the coming catastrophe. Austin is saying, no, Ukraine has a good chance provided we keep providing them with, all they need. And then Napolitano has another clip from General Cavoli, who is the commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, who basically says, no, the Russian military has not been negatively affected, basically contradicting Austrian. Now, this is incredible because obviously the implication of that is that if you keep the war going, despite the fact that the assessment is that the Ukrainians have essentially lost the war, what does it mean? It means you keep sacrificing the Ukrainian population, even the Ukrainian military. And, in a certain sense, it just shows in the most brutal form that this is a war in which, this is a proxy war in which the Ukrainians are just used as a pawn, up to the last Ukrainian, as it was said cynically already early in the war. So this is an absolute urgent, need to immediately stop this war, to come to the negotiations. There have been very important steps being made by Xi Jinping, who telephoned with President Zelensky, who initially said that he thought that this was a very productive discussion. And then one day later, Diarlov, who is the former head of MI6, went to Kiev and then the advisor to Zelensky basically said, no, China has to first prove that they break with Russia before they can have a role in this. Clearly repeating what the British had done already a year ago in March 2022, when there was a chance to have negotiations, including on the side of the Ukrainians. And then at that time, Boris Johnson had gone to Kiev, and then the whole negotiation track was interrupted. So twice you have the open, blatant role of the British trying to interrupt the hopes for settlement through negotiations. So that naturally brings the question, who is behind this drone attack on the Kremlin? It can be that it's not the Ukrainians, but the question of who is trying to prolong the war, then the question of cui bono is a quite serious question one has to ask, and, I think that this is really dangerous, and I think it should redouble all efforts by anybody who is trying to diffuse this before it's too late, like Pope Francis, who was just in Hungary for 3 days, and on the way back in the plane, he told people that he was involved in some peace negotiations. He had met with the representative of the Russian Orthodox Church and the papal nuncio in Hungary. So, I think it really is a very serious escalation, and it just means, we must be all really mobilized, because this one little mistake, and this can go wrong, leading to a general nuclear war, and that would be the end of civilization, and that would, if it happens, the last program we ever had, because, civilization would stop. So I think this has to be taken extremely serious. But I think the revelations of the leaks from the Pentagon and the, in my view, quite reasonable and credible statements by Larry Johnson on the matter, that should be taken into account when you assess of who could possibly be behind this attack.
Now, in the course of what you just heard, Helga referenced that there are organizations proposing the decomposition of Russia, which have apparently not noticed that the presence of thermonuclear weapons there. You're in a crazy world when people are more alarmed about the Earth warming through carbon emissions than the Earth warming rapidly and suddenly through thermonuclear annihilation. But what is the nature of the organizations, as well as the outlook, that's actually seriously discussing this insane proposal? Shut down Anglo-American break up Russia operation now is an article which has just recently appeared in the Executive Intelligence Review. It was written by Carl Osgood and Gretchen Small. We have Gretchen Small of Executive Intelligence Review here to discuss both that and the general implications of what much of what you've heard already. So, Gretchen? Glad that you're here with us, and I hope you're. Oh, there you are on the screen. Very good.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Right.
Take it away.
Right, take it away? Okay. All right. I have a suggestion for people. Please listen to what I'm about to say, this report, from with the same spirit of the stadium full of Celtic soccer fans celebrated May 1st in the middle of the game when they had been asked by now King Charles to pledge allegiance to the crown, and they broke out into a very boisterous, long chant, "You can shove the coronation up your arse." And with that, that's a very American sentiment. And with that sentiment, you'll need that. I think that'll help perhaps keep your nerves calm, because what we're looking at is very, very serious, frightening material, but you have to look at it. I'm about to tell you about beastmen who are all out to get us killed. You have to think about how Moscow is looking at what I'm about to tell you and what we did publish in this EIR. Brzezinski's Insanity Tours U.S. Threatens World War III, which I recommend you read because I can't go through all the details here, but this to give you an idea of what those details mean. Perhaps we should look at it that way. But so Moscow's looking now at the drone attacks, and they're looking at what happened in the United States that I'm about to tell you about in the last week of April, which they know very well. They're obviously on top of this operation, but most Americans don't know a thing about it. So far, it's been a relatively limited operation, and we would need to shut it down before it goes anywhere further, particularly in the U.S. Congress, which is very vulnerable for such operations, as we know. So in the last week of April, a group called the Free Nations Post-Russia Forum, they call themselves the FNPRF. We will call them here as much as possible the Post-Russia Forum. That group had a tour of the United States went through 3 cities in the U.S., lobbying for the United States to officially commit itself to a policy of tearing up the nation of Russia into pieces, 41 pieces to be precise. And that would be the only acceptable outcome of the war in Ukraine. That's the only basis for peace. That's what this crowd is arguing here. The only basis for peace is not just to ruin the United States, Russia, which has been stated by U.S. Government officials, not just to deliver it a strategic defeat, but that strategic defeat means wiping Russia off the map. Now, I want you to think for a minute that Russia is the second, if not the first, nuclear power in the world. They may have less nuclear weapons than we do. They have very new ones that we haven't matched in some ways. This is insane. This is really, really insane. So this group that came to the United States, who was there? 14 self-described future heads of state. All they claimed they're going to head up all kinds, just about any regional, ethnic division of Russia you can think of. Some of them are parts of parts in Russia when they list who they are. I'm not going to list them. Along with them are known figures tied to Russian terrorist networks. Ilya Ponoromov is a key one there. Leaders of the Chechen separatist forces, which carried out bombings of, they ran 2 wars to try to split up Russia. And in that process, they ran bombings of apartment buildings in the Moscow region. They took hostage a school full of elementary and secondary school students, about 1,000 people involved. These people are terrorists. This is really serious stuff. Their leader was there. By the way, the leader is the foreign minister of the government in exile, now based in London, of course, right? And a whole lot of Ukrainian activists hell-bent on destroying Russia. So you do have to note, I mean, there's some funny things in this if you want. They promise they're all going to ally with NATO, if not join it. All these 41 new countries that are come about. And listen, West, you are going to get the riches that Russia won't let you get your hands on. You're going to get its oil, you're going to get its gas, it's going to get your mineral resources, and you'll probably get it cheap from us because we're little tiny ethnic groups or regions that don't have the basis to defend any national development. So that gives you the smell of what this operation is. Now, look, it takes a lot of money and connections to bring a team of people to have online people hooked up to the United States, go from Washington, D.C. 2 days, Philadelphia for a day, and then to New York City. So they have backing. Let me give you a clue on that backing. The first 2 days were in Washington, D.C., were hosted by the Hudson Institute, whose Luke Coffey, that's the name of the fellow, well, I'll get back to him. He gave them a fawning welcome on the first day, and then he introduced the first speaker for the whole conference. And that fellow is Janusz Bugatsky from the Jamestown Foundation. He's authored a book called Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture, which he is busily having translated into Russian, by the way. He's very happy and pushing it. I have dubbed Coffey and Bugatsky the Bobbsey twins of the post-Russia Forum operation. They're there all the time. They're backing them. If you look at their Twitter feeds, it's full of them. Coffey has glory to Ukraine, the Nazi fascist Ukrainian call. Anyway, on his Twitter feed, Bugatsky is vicious on this stuff. They interview terrorists involved in the fight in Ukraine. They're really hardcore, and they are the public hands-on people in the United States with this post-Russia forum. So this didn't come out of the blue. This comes out of the hardcore imperial Anglo-American faction, which is determined to use the Ukraine war to wipe Russia off the map. They are making their move. That faction is making their move with this. This is a faction, and this is hard for many people to understand and believe, but this faction deliberately seeks a nuclear showdown with Russia. I think they probably insanely believe they could win that, but in any case, they're willing to test that truth out with our lives. And this operation of bringing the post-Russia forum, the free nations of the post-Russia forum here, is part of that move. One other thing while you think about the insanity of this, you remember that let me do it this way. You have to figure where you know who's behind the operation. Let me put it that way. With a stated goal of wiping out Russia is from that goal. And that's Great Britain. That's the monarchy. That's the imperial faction. They've been working at this for centuries. You've heard of the Great Game, probably. All of you have heard of geopolitics, that doctrine. The British monarchy does not like any big, prosperous, developing countries, especially if they're multi-ethnic and can be broken up that way. And that, I caution you, includes the United States, very much so. But they have had particular venom versus Russia since Peter the Great met with Gottfried Leibniz after having many exchanges with him before that, right before Leibniz died in 1716. Gottfried Leibniz is the German philosopher who not only gave Peter the Great the idea of putting together the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is a great treasure of the nation in terms of scientific capability, but it is his philosophy directly upon which we fought our American Revolution and in which our founding documents are based. So the British don't like that, and they particularly don't like when we get together. Russia has never been, except under the Cold War, when the British were already taking us over, an enemy of the United States. It is not our natural enemy. Alexander the II, I think it was, one of the Alexanders, Tsar, sent the Russian fleet to defend us from Great Britain's attempt to split us apart during the War of the Confederacy. This is a British project. The problem is, it is being now ideas from Britain. They have their SAS, they have their forces, but it's largely centered in the United States. And that has implications for our existence as a nation if these guys push this to the point of nuclear war. This is personal. You have to think of getting involved to take this stuff down when you think through the implications of that. Now, who in the United States? This is the Anglophile faction, going back to the Dulles brothers, the same group that did the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, the Libyan war, the Syrian war. Lyndon LaRouche called them famously the children of Satan. And we published a 3-part series, published as a book for his 2004 presidential campaign, going through the mindset of the beast men who believe that the world, it can be run and only run by terror, by war, by destruction, because man is inherently evil. The name Synarchist, where the name involved, Cliff, maybe in some of the discussion we can come back to that if that is useful. Lyndon LaRouche talked directly about this force, which is became embedded in our institutions, really in the post-war II period, after the Churchill came and we got the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, and they moved to retake the United States through these people that Lyndon LaRouche called, in a famous video he made, a documentary called Storm Over Asia, he called them a mercenary force, which, as he said, was first set into motion by policies adopted at a trilateral commission meeting in Kyoto, Japan in 1975. Policies originally of Zbigniew Brzezinski and his number 2 man there, Samuel P. Huntington. The policies which were continued by then Trilateral Commission member, that is back in 1975, George H.W. Bush, before he became vice president. This is material we've published and studied. If you go to EIR, if you're not familiar with it, you can look it up. I highly recommend it. But what LaRouche was warning in 1999 in his Storm Over Asia, that this mercenary force created then still exists. He said the primary responsibility for creating the force was the government of the United Kingdom. Now he's taking at this time most emphatically the government of Margaret Thatcher, a policy which has been accelerated and continued in full madness by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom. And he warned this war that these mercenaries were carrying out across the world, if continued, can lead to nuclear general war. And that is where we are today. Now, as part of this operation, which didn't come out of the blue, there have been 2 major seminars held in the United States directly proposing that the U.S. should adopt a policy of breaking up Russia as our strategic goal. The first was June 23rd, 2002. It was organized by something called the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Otherwise, it's the Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It is a government agency. It is mandated by law. It's basically run by the Congress, I think, but the State Department and the Defense Department have their people assigned to this operation too. And they held a lovely seminar calling the breakup of Russia, quote, a moral and strategic imperative. I won't go into that more. I have a little more on that in the article. But taking the lead in this operation are 2 institutions, the Hudson Institute and the Jamestown Foundation. Now, let me give you some background on who these guys are, because they are the Synarchist beastmen mercenaries that LaRouche was talking about. Jamestown was set up in 1984, basically, rather openly, as a CIA cover of private business that would do CIA tasks, largely at that time related to Soviet defectors. From the end of the 1990s to 2008, Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski was based out of the Jamestown Foundation. That's the time frame in which he wrote his book, The Grand Chessboard, and a lot of articles to that purpose, because he was promoting this scheme to revive geopolitics and break Russia. He was more limited. He only wanted to break it into 3 entities at that time. His operatives today at the Jamestown Foundation are going for all 41. And they identify themselves as, we represent the legacy of Brzezinski, and they're proud of it. So at the same time that he was at the Jamestown Foundation, it became the center, one of 2 centers in the United States, of something called the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya. Peace is like the kind of peace they're talking about for Ukraine today, that the only peace that would be acceptable is that Russia had to accept the separatist nation of Chechnya being separated off into a separate nation under the force of guns, which is what the terrorist operations they were doing it. And then later they said, well, why just stick to Chechnya? Let's do all the Caucasus. Now, that's where the Chechen jihadists, who are still represented now on the post-Russia forum, they were the protectors of them. This was really a cover operation for the SAS, CIA backing for those jihadists running the Chechen war. And the board of Brzezinski's AP, this Chechen American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, was completely, it's just one long list of the unipolar Project for a New American Century, PNAC. William Crystal, Robert Kagan, Norman Podhoretz, Michael Ledeen, James Woolsey, Richard Pearl, Allen, and I'm escaping me the third Richard, but you know all the names. So that's who the Jamestown Foundation is. They have a long history of operations and covert activities abroad, particularly aiming at Russia. Hudson has among its experts today the same crowd. You've got Douglas Feith there. Remember him? He was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the leading architect of the Iraq War under Richard Pearl. And you've got, remember this one, Scooter Libby, the former chief of staff of Dick Cheney, and of course Mike Pompeo from a more recent crown. The Hudson Institute's claim to fame is its founder was Herman Kahn, who authored the book Thinking About the Unthinkable in 1962, before he even founded the Hudson Institute, which is an argument that, look, guys, limited nuclear war is possible. Can't be too frightened of it. We have to think it through. We have to be prepared. Gee, we don't want it, but let's just act like you can have a nuclear war. So that's the mindset and the people here pushing this operation. So the Jamestown Foundation and the Hudson Institute in February of this year hooked up to do a joint seminar called Preparing for the Dissolution of the Russian Federation. So my co-author, Carl Osgood, and I, who both watched this, debated who was more crazy in there. That you have a bunch of cold warriors, operatives from the days of the CIA MI6 Captive Nations operation, which was used after World War II to whitewash and protect actually Nazi actual collaborators with Hitler from these parts of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and so that that's who these people were. And they debated who would be the first to break out of Russia. And Paul Goebel, who's of the Jamestown Foundation and likes to reminisce at post-Russia Forum meetings about the good old days of the Captive Nations meetings, he proposes Siberia, because he said, Siberia, I'm going to bet on it, it's going to be the first to break. Now, if you talk about resources, think about Siberia. I can tell you something that Scott Ritter is currently in Russia, and we should discuss this. I think it's worth it in the discussion period. And he has a lot. He started his tour in Siberia and has a lot to say about it. Anyway, these two Bobbsey twins have hand control over the post-Russia forum. I'm going to have to skip some material here, but they have the post-Russia forum was set up in Warsaw in early May 2022. Bugansky and Kofi have attended the most meetings of all the Anglo-American people who attended. The most interesting person who attended the first meeting from the United States, the only person I think who was outside the separatist ethnic operations, was the retired Army Colonel Christopher Miller, whose speech didn't say much. I mean, but he was fawning on them. You're on the front lines. You're the key. He was signaling, okay, we've got your back, and maybe more. Miller was not just acting Secretary of Defense from the time of the election where Biden was elected and until Trump left office. Before that, his whole entire background is special operations, combating terrorism, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operators, Low Intensity Conflict. He oversees the employment of special operations forces in counterterrorism, unconventional warfare, irregular warfare. You get the idea. And here he's addressing this. And I think this points up to what this operation, we have to view this operation. It's a public relations operation being built up for a policy drive, because they are insisting, these guys insist that the U.S., Western nations should recognize all these republics. So they're forming themselves to form dialogue channels. They're going to have their next meeting in Japan in July. Then they're going to be in London, of course, in September. And then they're going to have they've got a whole series of plans and action, and they're trying to get everybody ever involved in NATO to back them. But that's one side of the operation. But the other side of it is they're being built up as a hybrid warfare special operations, both as a new jihadi force like the Chechens were before, but also as a cover, I think, certainly, especially right at this time, of SAS, British SAS Special Forces and U.S. Special Forces. To sum up what they did here, without going through all the details in their April visit, I think the exchange between Bugatsky and Ponomarov, the Russian terrorist spokesman, is sort of gives you a taste for what they're talking about. He began the whole forum in Washington, and he said, "You have to seize the moment." That was the title of his speech. This is the moment, the only moment. We've got to do it now, or we won't have another moment. Make sure the failing Russian empire never rises again. You know, he gave him instructions how to think about it. Make your voices heard, set up offices in key capitals, coordinate on strategy, prepare for recognition. People must understand that your nations will be in line with Western values and will strengthen NATO's flank. And we can together make sure the West embraces the collapse of the Russian Federation. So then Ilya Ponomarev, this Russian terrorist, stands up. He was there in present for this operation, stood up and asked Bugansky the first question. And he said, he speaks very good English, by the way. He's very cool, former Duma member. He knows what he's doing. He's not some scruffy little character. He said, many in Washington greatly fear the collapse of Russia would bring chaos, instability, nukes, and bring down China. You are in an influential think tank, and you understand this. How do you recommend we deal with these fears? And what Bugatsky answered was on the question of nuclear war. He said, this is the biggest fear. And he had this tone of, oh, how silly can these people in Washington are. It makes no sense that Russia would use nuclear weapons against the opposition inside Russia. Nor would Russia use them against the West, since that would only escalate their destruction. And, you know, people are worried about even if it broke up, and then somebody could get their hands on these nuclear weapons and use them. And they said, oh, forget that. That's silly. The codes are under control, and these countries are going to be our allies. And so there's nobody out there who's going to use it. And he just said, you have to tell Americans, relax. We can do this peacefully. This can be done. Now, there are many people in Washington who agree with ruining the Soviet Union, Russia. They may agree with strategic defeat. They are not so insane as to back this. This is a move by a psychotic faction whose mindset is the beast man. And just to finish here, I think I've talked over my limit, but just to finish, the Ukrainians at their center of this, the whole operation is pivoted on Ukraine winning the war against Russia. And the Ukrainians involved in this thing, including Ukrainians who are card-carrying USAID operatives like Hannah Hopko, who spoke in this operation up in New York, these people are very open. As one of the co-founders, who's Ukrainian, of this post-Russia forum said in an interview he gave along the way as this was being built up, my goal is that when this is over, the only place where Rus, R-U-S, will appear on the map is at the end of the Belarus. And after that, the rest is all to be finished. There's more, but that's perhaps more than you needed. That's it for me for now.
Well, thank you very much, Gretchen. And it's definitely not more than what people needed. There was no problem in terms of the length of the presentation. And in fact, as you said, there are many matters that you brought up, which we're going to leave to questions. And let me just say to everybody, if you want to get questions to us, write to us at questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com. It's now there at the bottom third of your screen. Questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com. We do have a few questions that have come in already. We will get to them, but that will be after our next presenter. And this is Dr. Clifford Kiracofe, president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. Hi, Cliff. Good to see you. And I know that the presentation that Gretchen just gave has stimulated some thoughts in your mind. So take it away.
Hi, Dennis. Great to be here. And hi, Gretchen. Excellent talk and overview. Very exciting and introducing all sorts of new thoughts and dimensions to the situation that we find ourselves in. And I quite agree that this attack, I guess you could call it an attempted attack on the Kremlin, etc., is a landmark or a road mark of some kind of an escalation and a new phase we would expect in the conflict in the Ukraine. The key theme that you made, the dissolution of present-day Russia into several dozen little ethnic states, I think is quite important for people to understand. And one way to get a handle on that is to take a look at the historical context. And lately I've been taking a look at World War I. And as we know, World War I was a result of a conflict between various empires, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and the Turkish Empire. So the war was a conflict of national imperialisms. And of course, on the so-called Allied side, the British were taking a lead. The United States wasn't involved in the war until much later, 1917. What we need to take away from the World War I situation is precisely the points that Gretchen made about our current situation and the various lobbies and groups interested in two things. One, their ultimate goal is this fantasy, a delusional fantasy of breaking up present-day Russia into 40-some little countries. And the second point is the prolongation of the war so as to bring about the dissolution of Russia. If we take a look at the context, historical context, and go back to World War I, that's precisely what the British strategy was in World War I when they were confronting the alliance of Germany and Austria. And the British felt strategically that if they could bring down the Austrian monarchy, which lorded it over a bunch of different ethnic groups, that if you bring down the dynasty or the ruler, then you can break apart the Austrian Empire into little countries and thereby weaken the overall German strategy in World War I. How to do that? Well, prolong World War I rather than take advantage of various peace initiatives that had been launched. Now, let me comment just briefly on a few of the peace initiatives, just to give you an example, and you can compare that to today. Well, back then, in 1914, when the war broke out, immediately the Vatican, under the Pope, although that presiding Pope passed away and his successor picked up the thread, but the Vatican itself was trying to launch a peace initiative. Fast forward to today, we see Pope Francis trying to launch a peace initiative. Back in 1916-17, as the war progressed and got more terrible in World War I, and so many deaths unnecessarily, various peace initiatives were undertaken. And I'll talk about the Austrian one in a minute, but there was a peace initiative by Austria. There were some peace initiatives underway in Belgium, and there were some peace initiatives that Spain was trying to launch. And so we can see that there were, in Europe, across Europe, demands for peace and proposals for peace initiatives. Now, these would take the form of behind-the-scenes diplomacy, which is normal in this situation, quiet diplomacy or secret diplomacy, to try to get people together and work out differences behind the scenes. And once differences are worked out, then you have a public conference and have a peace agreement or ceasefire or whatever. But that behind-the-scenes diplomacy is needed. As to Austria, the Austrian question. The Austrian question had been looming in Europe during the 19th century. What was the question? Well, the question was, Austria was an empire composed of a variety of different ethnic groups, the Hungarians, etc. So there were the Czechs, etc. So there were a variety of ethnic groups within Austro-Hungary, as it was called back then. The British concept was to break up the Austrian Empire by bringing down the ruler, the king or emperor, as he was called, and by the dissolution of the empire, as I said earlier, into various little countries. As it happened, that did happen, and little countries like Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist anymore, it broke up, and Yugoslavia, which was another group of little countries that broke up. These sort of fake countries coming out of World War I rendered Europe unstable. And the British objectives then of weakening Central Europe and breaking up the Austrian Empire were achieved. among the main proponents in England of this strategy was a fellow by the name of Robert Seton Watson. He was the father of another Seton Watson who became a famous historian of Russia and Eastern Europe. Robert Seton Watson was a proponent of, and a lobbyist, you could say, in the United Kingdom, in England, for breaking up the Austrian Empire. He was actually the foremost spokesperson within the government of the United Kingdom, calling for the breakup of Austria. And just like we heard Gretchen tell us today, that there are voices like Brzezinski, who's dead now, but his voices are still carried on by his followers, for breaking up Russia. Of course, Brzezinski was a native Polish person whose father was a Polish diplomat who settled in Canada. So actually, when Brzezinski came to the United States as a student at Harvard, he was a foreign citizen. He was a Canadian. Later, he decided, maybe it's to my advantage to become an American citizen and worm my way up in government. His brother remained a Canadian citizen in Canada, but Brzezinski became an American citizen. At any rate, Gretchen mentioned him, so I thought I would comment on that. His teacher at Harvard, William Yandell Elliott, was also the professor of Henry Kissinger, and Elliott was quite an Anglophile, and that's a whole different discussion. Coming back to World War I and the United Kingdom strategy against Austria, Mr. Robert Seton Watson, it's hyphenated, created several groups to undertake the breakup of Austria, and he created different conferences, just like Gretchen was talking about conferences today. Well, Robert Seton Watson created some conferences of what came to be called captive nations in the Cold War era, but back then were the various ethnic groups within the Austrian Empire. And he held various conferences or meetings with all these assembled ethnic group leaders bent on breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The key leaders were from Czechoslovakia, Masaryk and Beneš, both Czechoslovak politicians and nationalists who wanted to break away from the grip of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I would point out that Mr. Brzezinski's wife was a niece of Mr. Beneš, who was involved in this whole picture of breaking up Austria. So what we see, just to summarize briefly what I just said, we see exactly the pattern that Gretchen pointed out. The British wanting to break up or dissolve an empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I, and now Russia in the present day, the new Cold War era that we're in. And we can see also the technique of using ethnic groups to advance that calls for the dissolution of Russia. Now, in the Cold War era, post-World War II, that was already organized, and that was under the Captive Nations Organization and a couple other organizations, all obviously with British and U.S. covert and overt support. Gretchen mentioned the Jamestown Foundation, and she mentioned the Hudson Institute, both of which are, of course, assisted by the U.S. government and its various agencies that we can imagine. Maybe AID, maybe CIA, whatever. So again, we have a very similar pattern to what the British strategy was in World War One. It's a carbon copy, basically, mentioned to break up Russia. Now, she mentioned this fellow, Ilya Ponomarev. Well, actually, his uncle, Boris Ponomarev, was a leading figure in the old Soviet Union, quite a Soviet nationalist. It's interesting that his nephew is anti-Russian. Gretchen mentioned beast men. That goes back to some of the research that was done on the neoconservatives back in 2000, 2001, and 2 and 3, when we just got into the Iraq War. Very few people in Washington had heard about neoconservatives until we were approaching the Iraq war in 2002, 2003, and some of the major voices calling for the war were part of this neoconservative policy network. We should just be aware that the neoconservative policy network, its roots were in the 1930s in New York City, where the Trotskyite cell at City University of New York, I think it was. At any rate, during the 1930s, these Trotskyists were obviously anti-Stalin. Well, not anti-Soviet, but anti-Stalin. After World War II, in 1945-6, or even during World War II, these Trotskyists became so-called anti-communist, and also they adopted the revisionist Zionism as their political ideology. That would be Vladimir Jabotinsky, and his philosophical basis was Nietzsche, and his political basis was Mussolini. So when we look at the neoconservatives, we see their intellectual roots first to Jabotinsky, and Netanyahu's father, as we know, was Jabotinsky's secretary. And then from Jabotinsky to Mussolini, who he admired, and then further back to Nietzsche. So that's where we come into this idea of the beast man. Also in Washington, with the neoconservatives, but also a faction of the Cold War hawks, they link more to Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher of the 17th century, and who was similar, we could say, to what Nietzsche became later on. So you have that Hobbesian perspective in Cold War hawks, who are not neoconservatives, but who are simply Cold War hawks. Now, I'll comment briefly on the neoconservatives and their methodology of action was influenced a lot by a philosopher by the name of Strauss, S-T-R-A-U-S-S. And Strauss came to the United States in the 1930s, fleeing Nazi Germany. However, he was the star pupil of Carl Schmitt, a top lawyer in the Nazi regime. So the Strauss explored many different philosophers of the past. He was an academic, but he also liked Hobbes quite a lot. And we can come later to the influence of Strauss on Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney if we want to, in questions. So this beast man that Gretchen was talking about is basically policy experts who basically will stop at nothing. And another important aspect is they lie. They themselves use disinformation, but blame that on other people. It's important to remember that part of this clique in Washington is the use of lies, bodyguard of lies, the use of lies and propaganda. In the old days, World War I, II, it was called propaganda. In more recent years, it can be called information warfare, psychological warfare, and at the outset of our talk today, Dennis mentioned cognitive warfare, mind control, cognitive warfare, which NATO and the US various agencies are developing to quite a high level. It's basically propaganda, but now it's and psychological warfare. But now the popular phrase is cognitive warfare. I think that's enough to summarize, because it would be great to have some discussion. So I was just trying to highlight some of Gretchen's points and give a little context for that. So Dennis and Gretchen, I think we maybe can go right on to questions now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cliff. We are getting quite a few questions. And again, let me just say that for people that want to ask questions, it's questions at LaRoucheOrganization.com. Gretchen, I'm going to give you the first opportunity because you might want to respond to what you heard from Cliff. And then I have one specific question because you wanted to amplify a few things about Scott Ritter. But why don't you go right ahead?
Well, actually, what I'd like to point out to people in this same issue of Executive Intelligence Review, we have an article as part of a package with the article Carl and I wrote called The Ukraine War Echoes of 1914 by Dr. Kiracofe. So I recommend that highly. Well, let's go on to the questions, I think.
Okay. First of all, let me just ask Hosea whether we have anybody on the line. If you don't have anybody right now, I have a couple of questions that have come in by email.
No one right now.
Okay, I'll just ask the first one. This question is from Don Hank. He asks, do you suppose Russia would join China in defending against the United States over Taiwan in case of war? That's the first part of the question. Do you suppose Russia would join China in defending against the United States over Taiwan in case of war? The second part is, who will rebuild Ukraine after the war? So, Gretchen?
I think the best bet is we better stop these wars, and as soon as possible, because if it Russia and China are currently fighting to defend one. They know their existence is at stake, and that's what's being called into question. They're very aware of that. They're coordinating. They're making policy, but they are interested in trying to create a world without this conflict. And I think that the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization has taken it even one step higher, which is we must get a new international security and development architecture to be able to answer any of these questions. Because it's very likely we go to war. There will be no rebuilding of Ukraine unless we stop this war. And the sooner the better. I mean, think of what they're doing to the Ukrainians. I'll come back to that later. There's a thing on the current Ukrainian leadership has a mindset it's worth people thinking about. I believe it was the current defense minister, Reznikov, but if it wasn't him, it was another of his level, who said in the last 3 months, I believe, that the U.S. and the West, NATO countries have to realize they will never find another country so willing to destroy itself for the sake of defeating Russia. So we're up against a fascist beastman, as Cliff was talking about there, outlook of people who are defined not by what they are for, not really for what Ukraine could be. I mean, it's like this post-Russia outfit is saying, hey, look, our resources are your resources. We're yours. We'll do what you say. We're going to be slaves. They're not looking out for their own people. Sometimes they talk about it, but that's not what they're up to. That's not how they think. That's not what they're doing. This leadership of Ukraine is out to destroy Russia. And I can give you 3 or 4 examples of it. And they all call the post-Russia Forum the 4th attempt by Ukraine to destroy Russia. Well, it's not Ukraine that does that. The Ukrainians are human beings like everyone else. And the majority of the Ukrainian population, I would bet, no polls needed or whatever, want war to end. And it's only a fanatic, hate-filled group of interests that do serve NATO, the British, and that faction in the United States who conceivably would be willing to destroy everything, including themselves, their children, their future, for the purpose of destroying another nation, of which they have great brotherly relations. So I think that we've got to focus on asking, how do we get out of the mess? What do we do? How can we stop this hardcore Anglo-American faction from leading us, from carrying out their policies? At the moment, it seems impossible. But it isn't. And it isn't because we are good. We are human beings. We have a capacity to change it. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all of the people some of the time. You cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And what we are at the point now where they're asking, the would-be rulers of the world are asking all of us to be fooled all of the time on things that we know is absolutely, completely impossible and absurd. And that is our advantage. That's why we publish things like the expose, because we want to stop it. Because there are people in Washington who are not nice, are not particularly good, perhaps, interests. They've always played the game. They're not fighters for peace like Ray McGovern or Scott Ritter. They're not. But inside the institutions, including in the U.S. military, there are people who are saying, let's not blow ourselves up. This is insane. And we have to know, knowing that, what we have to have is the greatest explosion in the United States and internationally of people who say, I hope there's a large protest in London today. They were hoping for 1,000 people. I don't know how it came out for the coronation. Not my king. This is not our government. We're going to take it back. Because if we get into debating, will there be war or won't there be war, if we allow it, it will happen. We have to say, here's what they're trying to do. It's insane. We can stop it. And they're very, very, very exposed right now. They really are. And people are very mad about it. And it just takes the courage of people standing up and saying so. And that breeds courage with other people. I'm telling you, look at the Celtic Stadium of people saying, you can shove your coronation up my arse. That's the spirit with which we have to shove your break up Russia operation up your you-know-what. I mean, that's what we have to have. Go out and have that perspective on it. As for who will build Ukraine, look, that has to be done as part of the new international security and development architecture. Because Ukraine is, we the LaRouche Organization and EIR published, and the Schiller Institute published a program, an idea of how that could work. Because Ukraine, look at it, it's in the center of connections between the West and the East. It should be the bridge between Europe and Russia and the whole Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative going through China and down through the rest of the world, countries of Asia. It has a role to play. We have to get the depleted uranium that the British tanks are bringing into there out of the agricultural land of Ukraine immediately, as soon as possible. Halt the war. back Pope Francis' initiative, back Lula's initiative, back China's initiative, talks, peace. We've come to the point where if you say, no, peace talks on how we solve it is the issue, that's a fighting issue with this crowd. They want war. We don't want war. We'd have to stop the war. And if we do that, then Ukraine, I mean, look, it's got tremendous potential. It's got tremendous agriculture potential. It's a tremendous logistics center for the Belt and Road Initiative. It can become prosperous as fast as possible, not by looting it like BlackRock intends. A radioactive field they're going to be looting, not by looting it, but by creating a world in which there is so much economic development going on because we're all cooperating on it, that there will be plenty of resources available, plenty of credit, so that we can all develop together. That's I think the questions we have to be asking and looking at it from that perspective.
Okay, Cliff, you have any comment on that question?
Well, sure, Dennis. First, I would just mention I spent 11 years in the United States Senate staff and also on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I spent 11 years in Washington writing Congress in the Senate. And people like, Biden and Kerry and all those characters that we hear about today were there, and I would see them and interact. I personally have never seen the Congress so delusional. I worked there in the decade of the 1980s, 81 to 92. I've never seen since then a Congress so delusional as we have now. It's very dangerous. There may be a handful in the Senate and a handful in the House of reasonable voices, but the rest are quite delusional. And as we know from Greek mythology, hubris or arrogance can engender nemesis, retribution. And so with that, I'll answer the first question, part of the question on Taiwan. Will Russia assist China if there's a war over Taiwan? Well, that's a complicated question. However, I'll make it very simple. Russia is a Pacific power. Russia is a Pacific power. Russia is not going to desire to see the stability of the Pacific interrupted by the delusional American war against Taiwan. Taiwan has been a part of China for 400 years, since the mid-1660s, but even centuries before had a relationship with mainland China, Fujian and other places. So first of all, Taiwan is part of China, like Hawaii is part of the United States. So if the United States wants to go to war with China by attacking Taiwan or supporting a Taiwan independence, there's no doubt in my mind that Russia would be supportive in some way of China, because Russian Pacific security is also involved. And that gets to be a complicated question, because you have what are the Japanese going to do, what are the other Asian countries going to do, etc. But that's the bottom line is I believe Russia would certainly help keep China's back. Ukraine. First of all, what is Ukraine? It's a fake country. It was created in 1918 by the German General Staff and the Bolsheviks, Lenin, etc. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which brought Russia out of the war and allowed Germany to shift westward against their enemies in the West. At the time this fake country of Ukraine was created, this geographic space, also the Baltic countries were released from the old Tsarist Empire. Ukraine means borderland. Ukraine means borderland. In the past centuries, these people were called Ruthenians. Just go to Wiki and look up Ruthenia and Ruthenians. The language was Ruthenian. That language is a a dialect. We can say it's a Old Slavonic dialect. About 60% of the Ukrainian language is Russian words. Maybe 20% are Polish words. There's some Romanian words, some Yiddish, etc. So it's a patois. It's a patois. The Ukrainian nationalists, in the early part of the 1900s and late 1800s, well, the late 1800s, the Ukrainian nationalists were assisted in developing their so-called language by philologists in Berlin, who, because Berlin had designs eastward, and using Austria, they had designs eastward against Russia, as the World War I demonstrated later. So Ukraine was already an unstable amalgamation of various ethnic groups. Russian, there was some a slice of Hungary in there, a big slice of Poland and Lvov and all that area there. So it's basically like Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia after World War I. It's a fake country that is a time bomb to explode. So to answer your question, which is a very good question, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, well, what territory, geographic space is going to be left of so-called Ukraine after this war? Less and less as the war goes on, it appears. Already, let's remember that the Donbass region of several, I guess you could say, provinces or parts of Ukraine are now incorporated into Russia. So from a Russian point of view, the Donbass region is Russian territory. Now, international lawyers can debate all that, but the point is that Moscow thinks that territorial zone is now part of Russia. Will it expand? We don't know. No one knows how this war is going to go, the fog of war. Will Poland want to grab back the northern portion of Ukraine? Will Hungary want to get its little piece back? Or what about Romania? So we don't really know the geographical status of Ukraine until we come to a diplomatic peace settlement that defines the state of the situation or the situation to be as well. So to answer your question, number one, Ukraine is historically an unstable amalgamation, a fake country, in other words, that was bound to explode, and the West took advantage of it as a proxy war against Russia that we've already discussed. How will Ukraine be rebuilt? Well, obviously the Russians, who are already rebuilding Mariupol and parts of the geographic space that Russia claims is now part of Russia, let's put it that way. And de facto, it is part of Russia. De jure, lawyers can argue. But Russia is already rebuilding parts of the territory that it has regained. Let us not forget that entire southern zone of Ukraine used to be called Novorossiya, and that was part of Russia. So Russians believe they are reclaiming lands that were once Russian. And to go back to this attack on the Kremlin, that's unifying the Russian people. It's not breaking the Russian people apart. It's unifying the Russian people who are demanding maybe even more strict measures in the war than President Putin and others want to do. They've been rather restrained. So to answer your question briefly, on the Ukraine side, you're going to have the Russians rebuilding what they consider to be their zone, and then the other zones that are left, whatever is left, obviously an international effort will go into that. And as was pointed out, the Belt and Road Initiative by China reaches across Eurasia and comes into Eastern Europe. So the Chinese who actually do have some investments in Ukraine. The Chinese can also be a part of rebuilding what's left of Ukraine. But first, you have to have in place a security architecture for Europe, a new security architecture for Europe. How are you going to integrate what's left of Ukraine into Europe? And then how are the Europeans going to assist rebuilding Ukraine, what's left of it? The Europeans started the war, didn't they? They rejected diplomacy and used Ukraine as a proxy, as Mrs. Merkel has admitted, as the French Hollande have admitted. So the Europeans, I think, the tab should certainly, they should certainly pick up a good part of the reconstruction of whatever's left of Ukraine. The Russians can take care of their own territory as they see it, but whatever's left, the rump state that's left, will have to be a European, Chinese, etc. Cooperative agreement. However, there has to be a new security architecture in place to stabilize Europe so that you can start undertaking rebuilding. So diplomacy first, and then economics and commerce second. So what we need is a peace. We need a diplomatic process. Let me make a point on that. We do not need a ceasefire prior to diplomacy. No, you can have diplomacy going on right now. And as has been pointed out, there are initiatives, peace, and even the Brazilians. There are peace initiatives that are being talked about behind the scenes.
Okay, we're having a slight problem with his internet, but
what we want to encourage is
Cliff, we're having a slight problem with your internet. What I will do, if that is the case, is reference something right now. Yeah, let me just do this while Jose, I guess you'll work on his internet, and let me just let people know a couple things here. First of all, if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's discussion, Man or Beast, British Cognitive Warfare on Humanity, or an International Harmony of Interests. We haven't talked that much about that second element so far because we're trying to get straight for people the actual agenda of what is actually happening over the course of this week, inclusive of the drone attacks. And what happens, we began the show by discussing several things that Helga LaRouche had to say about these incidents. And what has happened, and what I think is important for us to do, there's a question that I can have go to Gretchen while we're working on Cliff's connection. Are we back? Back? You are back. Okay, great. Because there are two questions. One is short, which I will now not go through, and there's a longer one, which you have to be able to hear, Cliff, otherwise it wouldn't work. So here's what it is. This question is from Renee Segerson. And here's what she asks, and you're going to want to take some notes on this one because it's got a few parts to it. I would ask Cliff and Gretchen to each address the role of three personalities whose role in this crisis illustrates how London and its allies exert power and influence by insinuating into our government people who are loyal to an imperial agenda. The three people are Samantha Power, head of the United States Aid for International Development, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and creator of the creation of the Hoover Institute, creation of the Hoover Institute, Michael McFaul, and third, Peter Thiel. Samantha Power, born in Ireland, raised first in London before her mother moved her to the United States, became a reporter for the London Economist and other publications as a war correspondent during the 1990s Yugoslav War. By the age of 30, she was being promoted by Harvard University, was inserted as an advisor to Senator Barack Obama when London had fixed on the idea of making him president. After her maniacal role as UN ambassador, she was nominated early on by Biden to head the USAID, a so-called independent agency that has been used to surround the State Department and cut off any traditions of diplomacy. She oversees a just under $50 billion annually, which is supposedly the leading, quote, emergency humanitarian fund on the planet. But since 2021, most of her time and effort has been directed to building up digital technology linked to warfare inside Ukraine and helping people oppose the negotiations. Now, that's the first. Then she says some other things. During 2022, she held more than 40 telephone and face-to-face meetings with Ukraine officials and citizens groups, especially after Boris Johnson's wrecking operation in April 2022. Work was largely aimed at building Ukraine as a war logistics center and in convincing the neighboring countries to help the refugees. All right, so there are members of Congress who object to this agenda for USAID, and should we address this? So that's the question concerning her, given that it's supposed to be, of course, a humanitarian organization, but she's actually spending much of her time in this sort of war buildup around Ukraine. Second, McFall. I just realized he has had decades of work with Stanford University, lived in Russia during the 1980s before the wall fell, has been director for years of the Freeman Spogli Division of Stanford University, the university's primary foreign policy division. He's one of the creations of that Hoover Institute that was crafted by Hoover coming out of the Versailles Treaty, closing World War I. And since it was designed, has been the seat of the world's largest library of war documents and revolution from across Europe. Important to just for people to know that. Third, Peter Thiel, an avatar-like personality entirely shaped by his relationship to Stanford and Hoover Institute. Since the 1950s, Stanford has been viewed as the so-called Nobel Prize winner in computer sciences. Their work on computers exemplifies what Brzezinski, under the guidance of Samuel Huntington, described as a technocratic New Age and human society, so forth. Now, she just ends by saying, although Brzezinski himself only had informal ongoing ties with Stanford and Hoover and created his own institute, it is easy to overlook how central this command center for British influence in the United States has worked. So there's basically a kind of concentration of her comments on obviously Samantha Power, but also the Hoover Institute and its descendants, if you want to call it that. So why don't I start with you, Gretchen, and see what you've got to say, and then go to Cliff.
Well, on Samantha Power and AID, a long time ago, in the 80s, I guess 70s and 80s. I mean, my general area where I've concentrated work is on Ibero-America, the nation south of the border. And at that time, AID was known as James Douglas in his book, The Unspeakable, on the Kennedy assassination, that I'm reading because Ray McGovern recommended it. And it's very interesting. Treats AID as equivalent of the CIA, and that it is the vehicle through which the CIA works, which is sort of the way it was known. This is what it has done in its history, by and large. Now, whether that is, I don't know the status. I'd be interested, Dennis, if Ray McGovern knows if that's an exaggeration or it's a vehicle. But it's been a vehicle used to carry out this kind of definitely not Kennedy-like foreign policy of the United States, of coming in and changing governments that you don't like. One of the speakers at the post-Russia forum in New York was a woman named Hanna Hopko, Hopko, Ukrainian. 41-year-old, very fanatically anti-Russia. I'm probably not going to find it quickly, but she was really manic that the opportunity is here to do this, and this is relevant. And she was also talking about something that is relevant to what Cliff mentioned, not so much Samantha Power. Well, it is Samantha Power, so let me get back to that. But what Cliff was mentioning about the Congress, the status of Congress. She was the lead speaker at that June 2022 conference I mentioned the first of the conferences on the moral and strategic imperative for breaking up Russia. She, at this latest, in April 28th, I believe she was up in New York at the Post-Russia Forum Group, and what she was totally excited about is the Ukraine victory resolution that has just been introduced by the congressional leaders of that U.S. Helsinki Commission, which held the conference where she spoke on breaking up Russia. And the Ukraine victory resolution was introduced on the 26th, so right in the middle of this post-forum operation in the United States. And as she said, manically, in addressing the conference, that it means that the U.S. Congress is on the same page as Ukraine, that there can be no peace without Ukraine being in NATO, 1991 borders, and for Ukraine, meaning Crimea and the Donbass are part of Ukraine, and there will be no peace negotiations until that occurs. There's a third part, which escapes me right now with the program. And then she went on to fanatically say that Ukraine will never be secure until Russia is broken up. Now, she's a USAID. Actually, Wikipedia says she's a USAID contract employee. I don't know that per se, but if you go look her up, she is USAID. She is Samantha Power's operation. She is got a National Endowment for Democracy award. Her basic NGO, she's the head of two NGOs in Ukraine. One's called ANTS. I'm going to forget now what it stands for. It's supposedly humanitarian. And another one is whose name I won't have it. I can't remember right now. But it's another one that is involved in international diplomacy on behalf of the Ukraine perspective of this faction of Ukraine, the Zelensky fascist perspective. And that was hosted, that's funded, this project is by the USAID. So that's a conduit. The USAID under Samantha Powers is absolutely a conduit into the US government and an operative in carrying out this policy, for whatever if that helps. This Ukraine victory resolution, look, what this really means is there can be no peace negotiations. That's what the attempt of this crowd is, no peace. We must have war to solve this, no peace. And so that is very important. Note that one of the co-sponsors of this resolution is Senator Roger Wicker, who made himself infamous. He's the ranking member of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, I believe, who made himself infamous in 2022, saying we should just bomb Russia. I mean, great strategic thinkers of our day, just bomb them, they bomb them with us. These people are crazy. Michael LaFall is we used to call him McFallball, and have written an article in Executive Intelligence Review, a whole profile. When he was ambassador to the U.S., he was Mr. Color Revolution. He did great damage to U.S.-Russian relations, and he's been doing it ever since. This program at Stanford has trained a whole, set itself up as a training ground in quote-unquote democracy of Ukrainian leaders. They've been coming over. They was stalled a little bit by the war, but they've been training 15 at a time, 20 at a time. They're creating a government around his ideas of a unipolar world, the West, the values, and the whole 9 yards. And he has set himself up a team jointly with the Ukrainian government. It's a matter of fact, it's jointly with the National Security and Defense Council, I believe, which is the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation. That's where the Center for Countering Disinformation is based. But they've had a team that since the war began have been putting out policy paper after policy paper. I stopped reading them because they were sort of the same old thing every time, of how the U.S. has the right and must immediately grab the 300 billion that we've frozen of Russian assets, that we have to take, sanctions and everything. So he's used the Stanford Institute as his basis for this operation, which is of a piece of the entire post-2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine. Zelensky went personally to address his outfit at Stanford for that reason. Peter Thiel, I know less, but let me raise something which I think should be an advertisement for people subscribing to the EIR's Daily Alert. A very interesting. I know Renee, who sent in the question, knows more about Palantir and this than I do personally, but this report, which we had in the should be in the Friday alert service, I would believe, is on how Ukraine is a living laboratory, quote unquote, for artificial intelligence warfare. It's an incredible thing. I'm not going to go through the details here, but it's a report on a March 24th article published in National Defense, the magazine, the technology magazine of the National Defense Industrial Association. We're looking at the military-industrial complex here, written by a former U.S. Major Army General, where that Ukraine, and this is quote, "We believe Ukraine is a laboratory in which the next form of warfare is being created. It is not a laboratory on the margins, but center stage, relentless and unprecedented effort to fine-tune, adapt, and improve AI, artificial intelligence enabled, or AI enhanced systems for immediate deployment. That effort is paving the way for AI warfare in the future." And the longer the war goes on, this Major General of the U.S. Army writes, that it is, and it reports there that Peter Thiel's operation, Palantir Technology, is one of those that's provided its AI software to the Ukrainians so they can get. The thing about AI technology is you can get super fast, sort of real-time data targeting and then shipping. And as some lunatics out there are proposing, that we'll have computers decide when to shoot and where to shoot and what to shoot. So the one thing that the other thing in this article says, quote, as an AI laboratory, the conflict is unique. Unprecedented funding, international engagement, and technological support from across the public and private sectors in a setting that may continue for several more years. The longevity of the conflict allows companies to fine-tune, adapt, and improve their AI systems on the go. If that does not make you sick to your stomach, if that does not show you that this is a proxy war to destroy Ukraine, and not on behalf humanitarian, forget it. They want to prolong the war so they can test the future of warfare. This is what we're looking at here. This is so cruel. This is monstrous. This is unspeakable. It's being done in the American people's name. The American people have to stand up and say, stop. This is really beyond. The only thing I have to say is at the end of the general writes at the end, and I don't know if he's just covering his arse or whether he is actually has some humanity left in him. He called it a tragic paradox that each day that the conflict continues and human beings are losing their lives in horrible ways, AI systems are being trained with real data from a real battleground, not to stop the suffering and end the war, but to become more effective in fighting the next one, the AI war. This is the mentality that we have to replace and eradicate. I don't know if that answers what Renee was asking, but I think it's sort of relevant elements. Cliff, I know you have things to say.
Sure, please go ahead, Cliff.
Well, I agree with Gretchen's summary of overview of the situation, and of course, it argues that AI part, which is really Orwellian and horrible, anti-human, argues for terminating this war as fast as we can and stopping this war. On the specifics of the question, I took some notes. Samantha Power. The biographical data that Dennis gave is very useful. She's from the UK. I would notice that he indicated she worked for The Economist magazine, which is an establishment, British establishment magazine, Rothschild kind of a publication, kind of infamous. And I would just note in that regard the Anglo-American linkage, that is to say, Washington and London. Well, she's right in the middle of all that, of course. The Anglo-American linkage, and that would be in more recent years from the 1920s, Council on Foreign Relations in New York as the main foreign policy establishment, institute, club, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, in London. So that's the nexus of this Anglo-American foreign policy establishment that Samantha is part of. I would just say I've had dinner with Samantha and some colleagues, and she's quite charming, but a real true believer. As you see, she went to Harvard, and real true liberal internationalism, so-called liberal imperialism believer. AID, that she's now in charge of, I would just go back to the Obama administration and remind everyone that she did serve in the Obama administration, and Obama created a special little office for her that involved regime change, human rights and regime change. And in that effort, she was assisted by McFaul and Dennis Ross. And the one case in point is Syria, the war in Syria, that Operation Timber, Sycamore, and all that. And she was responsible for what was called PSD 11, which was Presidential Study Directive 11, which relates to the Syrian regime change plan that they had for Assad. So she's been involved since the Obama administration in regime change. AID is part of that because it has money, and the AID, rather than sticking to its original mission of development, agricultural and industrial development, has got into the business of political warfare. And regime change is, of course, political warfare. Within AID, there was back in the Obama administration, probably still is there, the Office of Transition Affairs. And transition, what does that mean? Well, transition to a democracy. So Office of Transition Affairs is really a euphemism for Office for Regime Change. Now, she's head of AID now. So she's sitting on top of that $50 billion or whatever budget she has for political warfare. So, we can bear that in mind, and that was great that Gretchen pointed that out. McFaul, Professor McPhail. Professor McFaul of Stanford, he himself said that he's not a Russia expert, he's a regime change expert. Now let that sink in. He's not a Russia expert, he's a regime change expert. And I quite agree that he's not a Russia expert, and he never should have been sent to Moscow as our ambassador. It was a tremendous mistake. But, he helped ruin relations with Moscow. So this professor out at Stanford is a regime change professor, democracy professor, not a specialist on Russia, Russian history, Russian politics, et cetera, et cetera. No, he wants to overthrow Putin, et cetera, change the Russian system today. I would say, just in defense of the Hoover Institution itself, as an academic, I've been there, and it's an amazing archive of historical material. So for people like myself, academics, it is an amazing library and manuscript collection, unparalleled. Also interesting posters. They have some interesting World War II, World War I poster collection, art collection. But the manuscript collection is particularly superb and extraordinarily interesting. Now, that's what President Hoover intended, an academic place with archives, etc. but it has turned into kind of a neoconservative political operation rather than kind of a strict academic operation. And so McFaul can run his political warfare operations out of Hoover. I've visited Hoover, and I have quite good thoughts about my visit to Hoover and meetings with various people there. But the critical thing is it's a wonderful archive for academics. However, it's being maybe misused, you can say, by Mr. McFaul, and the prestige of the Hoover Institution as an academic center has been manipulated. I would just say George Shultz was involved out there with that. Condi Rice was out there involved in that. So you can kind of take a look at Stanford and some of the political people out there rather than some of the academics. Thiel. I'm not an expert on Thiel. However, I will point out that he and a number of these Silicon Valley people attended a Bilderberg meeting several years ago. I think that Bilderberg meeting might have been in Scotland, maybe, or London, I forget. But at that Bilderberg meeting, which is a high-level international club to kind of coordinate policy, like a think tank or a club. I call it a consensus building mechanism, like the Trilateral Commission and Bilderberg and the Circle and others. At the Bilderberg, this group from Silicon Valley attended the Bilderberg meeting, and my thought is that that's where a lot of this coordination of information warfare, of all the manipulation on the social media, etc., and censorship operations were discussed and planned out in general, conceptualized. So I think Thiel, and I believe Thiel may be on the board of the Bilderberg. I can't, the American branch of it, I forget. But at any rate, well, the point I'm making is a very high level coordination of very important movers and shakers from Europe and the United States around the information warfare, social media, et cetera, coordination to eliminate, Julian Assange is an example, to eliminate information that doesn't fit or suit the establishment. So that's all I would have to say about Thiel. His group of Palantir organization gets a lot of American defense industry contracts, millions and millions and millions of dollars. So very lucrative. Palantir, and I think he has a sidekick there that manages CARP or something that manages Palantir for him. But it's a very high tech computer software, etc. Contractor, we would say, to the American government, to the military-industrial complex, and no doubt the intelligence services as well. That's what I have to say.
Okay, there are several things we're going to try to do coming up on time, but there's still several questions. So I'm going to ask this question to you, Gretchen, and then I think I'm going to take a summary. There's also a couple of comments on this Peter Thiel matter, just that you may want to respond to, Cliff in particular. So the question, Gretchen, this comes from the chat. It's unidentified who's asking it, and it just says, that's why the world needs to de-dollarize. The sabotage and war funding is all because the United States can just print money out of thin air to do these things. What do you think about this?
That's just another way of putting that. One of the things that we have been arguing is that the key to stopping the war drive is to pass Glass-Steagall. The world is moving out of the dollar very rapidly. The United States has to leave out of the dollar because this dollar we have today is not our dollar. My husband Dennis gave a whole presentation, not a whole presentation, but talked about this at the last Schiller Institute conference. It's a City of London controlled dollar, free floating, run by the speculators. We need to return to Lincoln's greenback. We need to return to Alexander Hamilton's program. And then the driver for the war is precisely the collapse of the entire post-war financial system that has been, actually it's a collapse of centuries of a system based on speculation and monetarism. There was a fight back and forth between national governments who would say, no, the monetary issues are credit issues for the building of our nations. And then you always have this oligarchical interest centered in London with their little Wall Street cousins in the short time that we've existed as a nation, who say, no, the speculators must do things because, money is king, money is God. I mean, we've talked about this in human history a lot, what matters. And if they have reached a point now where, because of the sanctions, because of the collapse of everything, because there is no productive capability backing up the US dollar, the way there was after World War II, when we had an economy that had produced what was required to work with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazi onslaught. And we've destroyed that. And we've destroyed it by letting speculators take over. So the de-dollarization move is absolutely critical for forcing the issue on the United States and Europe to get off it, to get off this monetarist, imperial, oligarchical commitment that power runs the world, and to get back to being a nation. And that is, that's what we're working on here. That's another way of saying what the answer to the first question I had, which is, will they go to war? Yes, Russia will probably back China if it comes to that, and then we'll probably be fried. So we think we should discuss how to stop it. And the passage of Glass-Steagall in the United States, which is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt law, which from 1933 to 1999, basically, when it was completely eliminated. They messed with it before, but what it did, there was no financial crises between when that bill existed, because the government, under the Glass-Steagall Act, defends commercial banking, sustains the banking system, checks the banking system, commercial banking, deposits, lending, economy, real economy, the people. And the investment banking, meaning the speculators, take care of themselves. And if they've speculated so much, which they have now, we have, I believe, the going figure is maybe 4 quadrillion in monetary assets, including the derivatives. I mean, maybe it's only 2 trillion, who cares? It's the same thing. That system has, that parasitical system has eaten its host. And therefore, the host nations are rebuilding and becoming nations. And Glass-Steagall would completely allow the isolation, the protection by isolating the commercial banking system, which the country needs, the deposit savings, what we used to have, savings and loans, remember that? Where, the banking institutions related to the community, related to national production, the ones that can be the vehicle for credit issued from the U.S. Treasury for projects of long-term infrastructure projects that are needed for new cities that we want to build, for new universities we might want to build, all those kind of things, that is totally protected, split off, and the investment banking derivatives and a lot of their debts, which are basically illegally done, imposed on foreign nations, those get wiped out. And the nations can proceed. And a couple of bankers ought to go to jail. And some people are going to go bankrupt. Or maybe they can just go get a job like most people.
So, Cliff, we have something for you. I think Jose's got a few graphics which would just help. This relates to the Peter Thiel question. We were talking about it before and trying to get some idea about it. He wrote a piece called The Straussian Moment. You want to show that, Jose, if you have that there, the graphic? And I'm going to read to you, Cliff, a little quote from, yeah, that's just the piece. It's about 30 pages. And it's the kind of thing that merits its own discussion, Cliff. So I just want to indicate, after a long quote there, actually, if you leave that up, Jose, I can just use it. It's a long quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson, first of all. Those of us who remember Into the Valley of Death, Rode the 600, the Charge of the Light Brigade, understand what quoting Tennyson means. It's a colonial mindset I would reference here. So, but there's a section that says it right after that. The 21st century started with a bang on September 11th, 2001. In those shocking hours, the entire political and military framework of the 19th and 20th centuries, and indeed of the modern age, with its emphasis on deterrent armies, rational nation states, public debates, and international diplomacy, was called into question. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I did not call the entire 19th and 20th century into question because of 9/11. That's just me talking. That's not him talking. But he calls this the Straussian moment, and he's referring to the so-called political philosopher Leo Strauss, whom you referenced before. Cliff, if you can just show the picture of Leo Strauss there, Jose, just so people have a picture of who the person is. No, that's not Leo Strauss. That's somebody different. That's okay. First, go back to Leo Strauss. You had him first there. That's him. And he wrote a letter to the next individual that you have portrayed, Carl Schmitt. Go to the next picture. So here, now, Carl Schmitt, just so people have a sense of this, born in 1888, died in 1985. He was known as the crown jurist of the Third Reich. In other words, he's like the chief judge, if you will, in terms of the arbiter of law for the entirety of the Nazi regime. So in September of 1932, Leo Strauss wrote a letter to Carl Schmitt which said, quote, "The ultimate foundation of right is the principle of the natural evil of man. Because man is by nature evil, he therefore needs dominion. But dominion can be established, that is, men can be unified only in unity against other men." So if anybody has wanted to wonder about the character of American foreign policy and what has been happening with it, we began talking about this in 2003 as the Iraq war opened up, and Lyndon LaRouche said to all of us, we asked, what should we do? He said, get Leo Strauss. And several people didn't know who Leo Strauss was, and we said, who is he? Well, now all of you have heard who he is, and I'm going to ask you, Cliff, to both comment on that, but as we go to the end, I want to ask the final question. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, I'll respond, this will be the final question. I want both you and Gretchen to kind of put together in your responses kind of whatever remarks you'd like to make, but also you'll hear from the question why I'm doing it this way. This is a question from Michael from LA, California. He asks, he says, Washington has been practicing evil for decades, and the evil in Washington is now reaching heights never before experienced. Why do the insouciant Americans tolerate their daily humiliation by evil people in Washington? So with the Straussian quotes in mind, and the fact that we're winding up, please go right ahead, Cliff, and give whatever thoughts that you wish.
Well, first on Strauss, he was very influential to the neoconservative policy network. So he's not just some isolated professor at the University of Chicago. He actually had political influence. And there's a book by Professor Shadia Drury, D-R-U-R-Y, two books by her, Leo Strauss and the American Right. And, well, she has several books on Leo Strauss that are very good and place him within the American political context. And as I say, he influenced Rumsfeld and he influenced Cheney. And one of his main themes was this big lie, the noble lie. You have to, Thrasymachus in Plato, for example, you have to lie to the public because you have these noble goals, and so on. And then he brought in Hobbes. When he left Germany under Carl Schmitt's tutelage, he went to London. He studied Hobbes, and then from London, the Rockefeller Foundation picked him up, and he came to the United States at the University of Chicago. So that's Leo Strauss, and he's important in American politics, particularly through the neocons, but also through the West Coast Straussians under Harry Jaffa, etc., out of Claremont. I would just say that, just in summary, this Beastman problem, we were talking about in 2003-04, I think. There was a Children of Satan pamphlet that was done by the LaRouche Organization, which went into Strauss and all this stuff. But it's still important in Washington, D.C. So basically the lies, lie about policy. And to answer the question, how is it possible for Americans not to pick up on all this? Well, the major media is part of the information warfare network of the federal government. So your major media in the United States, whether it's print media, newspapers, et cetera, or TV, et cetera, the major media is basically a mouthpiece of the U.S. government. So therefore, it's impossible almost for the American people to really understand what's going on in the world because they do not have the information. Fortunately, organizations like the Schiller Institute and independent social media people and Twitter now a little better under Musk, for those who wish to learn a little bit more, can turn to alternative sources of information. But generally, they're brainwashed by the American media, and that will include NPR, the radio station there, another form of brainwashing of the American people in support of the military-industrial complex. So, in conclusion, I would just say I would advise interested citizens of this country, of the United States, to seek out independent information, independently of major media, mass media. Take a look at what Schiller Institute is doing. Take a look at the Executive Intelligence Review's analysis and reports. Get on Twitter and see if you can pick out some people that have interesting perspectives that are independent of the military-industrial complex in Washington. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Gretchen?
Well, let me introduce Scott Ritter as a way of getting into the answer. He's in Russia now, and he's technically there for, he's presenting his book. He has a new, I think it's a new book, but he's presenting his book on disarmament. Must be in Russian for him to be there. It started in Siberia. And I happened to watch last Wednesday night because it was the night of the drone incident. Someone alerted to me that he was going to do one of his Ask the Inspector programs online from Irkutsk in Siberia, and I thought he might have something to say about it, which he did, which was extremely harsh. He said, I can tell you what would happen to whoever would send a drone against our White House, that whoever sent it would cease to exist. They would be wiped out. He said, I can assure you that. He was speaking very military-like when he said that. He also said, think about this. The Kremlin was hit. And he repeated it. The Kremlin was hit. Someone will pay for this. Now, he didn't go further into the U.S. and British aspect of it, and he said, but what he gave it, mostly what he went through on the discussion was very interesting, made me very happy. He's a good ambassador for the American people, for the actual American people over in Russia. He's excited. Now, he knows something about Russia, and which he was a Cold War baby. He was in the military and trained in the military. They were the enemy. And then when he became involved in disarmament, as I've heard him speak about it, I've never talked to him personally about it, but he's talked about it. He went over there and he worked on, I believe it was the INF treaty, that they were doing mutual inspections and making it work. And he loved what he found. He loved the Russian people. He was excited. They became friends. They worked and whatever. And he is, because of his background, was a Russian historian. He said, but this is an eye-opening trip. I have to rethink everything. Everything has been just wonderful. They took me, he said, Americans think Siberia, people wrestle bears and it's nothing. He said, let me tell you something. I was in Novosibirsk, the capital of this vast region. And he said, I got a background tour of the Opera House. It's one of the best in the world. So they could match the New York Philharmonic or maybe better. He said they have, it's a business center. They've got innovations. They're driving forward. Yes, they face the sanctions. They're very hurt that they've been cut off from the West and the United States. They're angry, but they're going forward. And they're working with the Chinese and the Indians and the Iranians now because they're going to go forward. And someone asked him, how did your Russian friends that you were with react when they saw the drones on the phones? Did they get, they must have been frightened. And he said, they're not hysterical, like emotional people like the Americans. Russians are very calm. They don't panic. They looked and they said, It registered. They knew what had happened, and they went about their business. He also said they don't like the war. They support the war and they support defending Russia, and they know Russia is under attack, but it's a war against Ukraine, which was part of Russia for years. It's like a fraternal thing, and it hurts, he said. But the thing that I was thinking about, my reaction was, this was a good, you've heard about ugly Americans. Scott Ritter is a good American. He's there, he's learning, he's talking, he's happy about it. He's representing the United States that is fighting the monstrous evil that I believe it was Michael mentioned. And the thing that he reported that has bowled him over is that people are not just coming to sign his books in so much time that they have to extend them out. He's there. He said, and people who come to hear me, they're people who knew me. When he goes out for a walk in the streets in Irkutsk or in Novosibirsk, just to walk around and look around and see what's what, people come up to him and say, are you Scott Ritter? That's what Russians want. As he said, Americans, we are the ones losing. We are the ones behind. We should be friends. So I think that the whole thing interested me. There's obviously more to it. He's not just one single person. That indicates more than like the Seymour Hersh thing. There are things going on in this country we don't know about, of people who have not come forward, like Jose Vega comes forward and confronted it, but that are doing in their way what they can to head off this unbelievable evil crisis that's going on. So that we should take confidence and be happy that we have a representative in Russia right now who is like the Americans who want peace. Because anybody who's seen him knows he's fighting for that. Whatever, you don't have to agree with every last thing he says, but that he's very, very serious about. So second to that, on the question of the American people, of which I am one, I very much appreciated what the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, told the conference in concluding her statement to Diane Sayre's conference on April 22nd. She's the LaRouche Organization backed independent candidate for Senate in New York State. And she had this meeting, but if you haven't seen, you should watch it. It's a lot of fun. And it's a lot of people from very different perspectives of whatever coming together around stopping war. And she was, Diane spoke last, but Helga addressed it. And she said at the end of it, American people are good. We come from a good republic. We have to act on that. And I appreciated it because somehow maybe because Kennedy was my president as a child, maybe because I discovered Lyndon LaRouche in college and have spent my life fighting with him. He was an incredible patriot who understood who we were as a nation, knowing all the evil, fighting every ounce of evil thing we ever did during his lifetime, but knowing who we were founded to be in this nation. So I recommend to people at this time, you have to be like Scott Ritter, learn about these countries, learn about China. I mean, by the way, the Break Up Russia group is setting up a Break Up China group. I mean, it's all the same. It's all the same thing as what Cliff was talking about, regime change people. How we got this bad, I'm sort of always laugh because Lyndon LaRouche once wrote in The Toynbee Factor, a major piece he wrote, that soap operas, the introductions of soap operas in the 1930s were the key to the beginning of the destruction of the American population's ability to view reality. And so that reality for most Americans is sort of limited. It's my little group. Now, it wasn't always this way at all. That's not native to America. That's the way it's become. And so you say, I can't change the big thing, I'll change a little, and wars happen over there. Well, let me tell you something. We have to remind and tell our fellow Americans now, this war is nuclear. That's the war we face. We're not going to get a diplomatic solution unless we change the policy. There's no limited diplomatic solution to this. We have to break the back of the Anglo-British control over the United States. We have to become the United States of America we were founded to be. And I think it's very useful. It's useful for me. I think when you're feeling scared and frightened and wondering, go back and read Alexander Hamilton. Read Abraham Lincoln. Read his speeches. Look at what he did in the Gettysburg Address. We should all have it on our wall. That is look what Roosevelt did. He pulled the American people to fight fascism and to build a world that was to have been development for everybody. We have riches at our hand. That is where we'll get the strength to finish off these bastards. And if we don't, this war will be on us.
Gretchen Small, Dr. Clifford Kiracofe, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody also for joining us today for this discussion. So in our wind up, we'll take this matter up because there is no way to let Americans or anyone else get off the hook on this one. The real issue for why Americans tolerate what they tolerate is what they tolerate in what they call entertainment and culture. It's the death of classical culture, which is the reason for this. That's why. Now, if you want a way of looking at that, we'll approach it in the way that Helga LaRouche addressed today's coronation of King Charles. Now, the British monarchy has been the greatest source of evil of the last approximately 400 years, well, be more specific, since 1763, and has remained that. It is not the United States, which is the greater source of evil. It's the British Empire. And it is the United States capitulation to the British Empire in the form of American popular culture of today, which is the cause of the problem. It's what you like which causes the American to not and to tolerate this problem. Now, this is therefore something that is under people's control, and that's exactly why people don't want to admit that it's true. They'd rather hear that there's this great big force, this really deep state, and we don't know who they are, and we don't know where they live, and we don't know how they do it, but they just run our lives like crazy, and we are helpless in front of that. And that's what people would prefer, but that is not actually the problem. The problem is not big brother. The problem is little brother. The problem is the self-isolating, self-enslaving behavior, but also desire of the people. So this is important. This is why we are not a democracy. And you notice something? There's only two terms that people popularly refer to America as. They'll either say America is an empire, and then they'll denounce America. Or they'll say America is a democracy, and we must defend it. America is neither of those things. Now, whatever your emotional response to that is, America is neither of those things. America is a republic. And republic requires that its citizens have a responsibility to govern the republic, not that their citizens vote. That is not what the citizens of a republic are supposed to do. And what happened recently, and what happened in specific around this matter of the Julian Assange and the freedom of Assange, which was a recent occasion, is Helga LaRouche put out a statement. We referenced this before. I'm going to put it up again. And she said at its conclusion, the heads of state who assembled this weekend for the coronation of King Charles can prove their commitment to freedom and democracy by congratulating the newly crowned king for making his first act of freedom, the freedom of Julian Assange. Because, of course, that would require a human response from those heads of state. And would immediately, of course, transform them. Now, that, of course, is an irony, because the last thing that those people that were assembled there for that coronation would dare to do was to even bring up the case of Julian Assange. Well, Julian Assange himself weighed in on this with a statement which we're going to read to you in part that he made. And he said the following: "To His Majesty, King Charles III, on the coronation of my liege, I thought it only fitting to extend a heartfelt invitation to you to commemorate this momentous occasion by visiting your very own kingdom within a kingdom, His Majesty's prison Belmarsh. You will no doubt recall the wise words of a renowned playwright. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Ah, but what would that bard know of mercy, faced with the reckoning at the dawn of your historic reign? After all, one can truly know the measure of a society by how it treats its prisoners, and your kingdom has surely excelled in that regard." Now, this is a man who has been tortured in jail and has been imprisoned merely for using the internet in the way in which it was not designed to be used. People say, oh, the internet was designed to be free and open, and no, it was not. It was designed in exactly the way in which it's being used in Ukraine. It was designed as a tool of control and manipulation, a kind of do-it-yourself panopticon, sort of a self-surveillance machine. And in regard to this, of course, it took a while to get us to the point that we're at now, or we're going to now, in which reality itself is under being contested with various ideas of it. Helga LaRouche, in her statement on Julian Assange, also included this, which goes directly to the context of what we've been discussing all day. She said, in reality, in the mainstream media, honest journalism has almost entirely disappeared. The very notion of a historical or objective truth which can be unearthed by investigative journalism has been buried by a barrage of projectiles which pierce through that very concept. What has come in its place is an arbitrary variety of descriptions of that truth, which are either named as fake or must be debunked or even crushed before conception by being pre-bunked. In reality, there is a brutal fight for control of the narrative of the rules-based order, where journalism has been degraded to serve as the executioner on behalf of the ruling elites. If this were an exaggeration, Seymour Hersh would have received a newly created Nobel Prize for Excellence in Journalism in Norway, and all the Norwegian media would have excelled in reporting about the role of Norway in the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, what's been done to the American people is very simple. What has happened is that you have lies being told to you to your face. And these lies are told to you about foreign policy, they're told to you about the economy, they're told to you about one another, they're told to you about the elections, and they are tolerated, each one after the other. And there is no boundary that will not be crossed by the Straussian perpetrators of the great lie, because the lying is a principle with these people. It is conscious, willful, deliberate, and the means of ruling, because as long as you back up when you hear the lie, then you are proving that you are morally unfit to govern yourself, and you won't. Problem involved is that since this is a thermonuclear age, others who are in a world in which they do not tolerate and do not accept this form of so-called government, of tyranny, have stated that they would prefer to die rather than live under it. And what is the case is that those who have seized control of the United States are banking on the idea that those people don't have the guts to actually do that. They think that, well, actually, they're inferior. So really, since they're really slaves, slavery is actually genetically within their makeup. That's how they actually think. So slaves are not going to risk their lives to fight for some principle of freedom, because that's not who they are. We're better than they are. We have a superior so-called military culture than they have. But that actually is a mentality which is very weak. It's a mentality which is one of moral senility. And it can be punctured and destroyed in exactly the way that Julian Assange has done in his statement, and Helga LaRouche also referenced. Ray McGovern, we've referred to a couple of times, former Central Intelligence Agency officer for 27 years, on two occasions has illustrated or demonstrated the principle of intervention. Now, this principle of intervention is what the people of the United States as a whole have to take up and make a national pastime. The intervention is something which will show you first in the case of Ray McGovern confronting a consummate liar, Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, who together with a crew, including Darth Vader Dick Cheney, took the world into the Straussian moment of the post 9/11 Iraq war. So first of all, we'll use this first intervention, which is one type of intervention.
There have been many explanations offered for why, in one of the times of the greatest political turbulence in American history, there has been comparative apathy in places that have been past venues for public protest. One answer, that the administration has been outstanding in cherry-picking not just intelligence, but also the makeup of the crowds that greet or interact with its key players. Our fifth story in the countdown, that latter component, the governmental equivalent of the cone of silence from the old TV series Get Smart, this afternoon broke down again for the second time in 6 days. First, the president's lambasting by Stephen Colbert at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and now today's vivisection of Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, with only Rumsfeld's own words as weapons at a speech in Atlanta. One of several interchanges with critics, in this case a former CIA analyst, lasting 4 minutes. Here it is in its entirety with fact checks.
I'm Ray McGovern, a 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency and co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. I would like to compliment you on your observation that lies are fundamentally destructive of the trust that government needs to govern. A colleague of mine, Paul Pillar, who is the top agency analyst on the Middle East and on counterterrorism, accused you and your colleagues of an organized campaign of manipulation, quote, I suppose by some definitions
could you get to your question,
that'd be
please?
called a lie. Atlanta, September 27, 2002, Donald Rumsfeld said, and I quote, there is bulletproof evidence of links between Al-Qaeda and the government of President Saddam Hussein. Was that a lie, Mr. Rumsfeld, or was that manufactured somewhere else? Because all of my CIA colleagues disputed that, and so did the 9/11 Commission. And so I would like to ask you to be upfront with the American people. Why did you lie to get us into a war that was not necessary and that has caused these kinds of casualties? Why?
Well, first of all, I haven't lied. I did not lie then. Colin Powell didn't lie. He spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence Agency people and prepared a presentation that I know he believed was accurate. And he presented that to the United Nations. The President spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence people. And he went to the American people and made a presentation. I'm not in the intelligence business. They gave the world their honest opinion. It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction there.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not. I said I knew where suspect sites were, and we were just...
You said you knew where they were, near Tikrit, near Baghdad, and northeast, south, and west of there. Those are your words.
My words were that... No, wait a minute, let him stay 1 second. Just a second.
Just a second, indeed. Rumsfeld's words about WMD, March 30th, 2003, on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, were, quote, we know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north somewhat.
This is America, huh?
Yeah. Go ahead. You're getting plenty of play, sir.
I'd just like an honest answer.
I'm giving it to you.
We're talking about lies, and your allegation that there was bulletproof evidence of ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq.
Did Rumsfeld make that allegation? Indeed, he did. September 27th, 2002, to the Chamber of Commerce, right there in Atlanta, quoting, we ended up with 5 or 6 sentences that were bulletproof. We could say them, they're factual, they're exactly accurate. They demonstrate that there are, in fact, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But they're not photographs, they're not beyond a reasonable doubt. Still, Mr. Rumsfeld again had to face his own words quoted back to him. How to do that? Change the subject.
Was that a lie, or were you misled?
Zarqawi was in Baghdad during the pre-war period. That is a fact.
Zarqawi? He was in the north of Iraq in a place where Saddam Hussein had no rule. That's where he was.
He was also in Baghdad.
Yeah, when he needed to go to the hospital. Come on, these people aren't idiots. Yes. They know the story.
You are... Let me give you an example. It's easy for you to make a charge, but why do you think that the men and women in uniform every day when they came out of Kuwait and went into Iraq put on chemical weapon protective suits? Because they liked the style? They honestly believed that there were chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on his own people previously. He'd used them on his neighbor, the Iranians, and they believed he had those weapons. We believed he had those weapons.
That's what we call a non sequitur. It doesn't matter what the troops believe. It matters what you believe.
I think, Mr. Secretary, the debate is over. We have other questions, courtesy to the audience.
In the aftermath of...
Yes, indeed, the debate was over. And Rumsfeld was served, as it said. He was owned. Okay, he was postered. But that's one kind of intervention, and that's of a certain type, and that's in the American context. It's very aggressive in that way. Here's Ray McGovern doing another sort of intervention at the Oxford Union, one of the most quote, prestigious of British institutions. It's celebrating its 200th anniversary this year, in fact. And it's Rumsfeld, it's McGovern going after and describing the problem of the Fifth Estate, that is to say, the Fourth Estate first, the press, and the destruction of the American press, the exact same matter that we've taken up around the issue of Julian Assange and the issue of truth, and then appealing to the idea of what he calls the Fifth Estate.
Where is the zig there? Well, the Fourth Estate, bragged about by your statesman in Parliament, saying the Fourth Estate in the press gallery is more important than we three estates in Parliament. Edmund Burke was his name. The Fourth Estate is moribund, if not dead. And when Jefferson was asked if he had a choice between having a free press and a government, what did he say? A free press every time, because we need a free press to keep the government from oppressing other people. Now, what's the hope here? Well, the hope here is that there are mechanisms now that are piercing the clouds and releasing the truth. And I would like to cite one of the greatest pieces of American literature. It's having its 50-year anniversary this year. It's the letter from the Birmingham City Jail written by Dr. King. And he said, like a boil that cannot be cured as long as it's covered up, but must be opened with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so injustice must be disclosed with all the friction that its disclosure creates. The light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Well, that's happening now, folks, because we have a Fifth Estate. And I understand there's a movie by that name. And I'm going to sue for copyright infringement because I've been saying there's a Fifth Estate for 2 years now. The Fifth Estate, where is it? It's in the ether. I don't know exactly where it is, but I know that WikiLeaks is using it. I know that we know things that, to quote another gospel verse, nothing that is hidden will remain hidden for very long. There's a bumper sticker that says, Jesus loves WikiLeaks. Luke. I forget the verse. Look it up. Is this me here? Okay. All right. I just want to finish with a little poem, 2 stanzas from one of my countrymen. His name is Seamus Heaney. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles. And I would add, believe in the American dream. Thank you very much.
So that's an intervention in Great Britain, in the core of the establishment of Great Britain. It's of a, actually as vicious in the positive sense, a nature as the one against Rumsfeld, as effective, I'll say. So we leave you with an intervention where the term here is more like that what you do with an alcoholic or drug addict and so on. Not the idea being that these are people or circumstances in which the person is unable to give themselves help and someone else has to come into the situation to help. And this is Lyndon LaRouche talking about the problem. He's posed a problem which initially seems to be around music and popular music. And he does something with that to indicate the real problem.
Yes, Mr. LaRouche, Joseph Bulick from the Chicago chapter. I have a question about music. Mindy Petchnick and Sheila Jones have been working with me in my bel canto singing and things along that nature. But I have a question that has been proposed to me by Generation Xers and baby boomers, which I am unable to basically relive in their own minds. I understand it somewhat in principle, but I'd like to help you elaborate with this with me. I have friends that support me in the ideas and the principles of this organization and movement, which is probably the greatest movement in history. And it was coming along the lines of this. Yes, I believe in what you're doing, and what you're doing is good on the basis of principle. Yes, that man is in the image of God. But my friends listen to rock and roll, or they listen to house music, or other things other than classical. And I was trying to get them to understand my principle perspective on it, that it helps you in developing the cognitive principles of your own mind. It shows you how your mind works, basically. And they told me, well, I can go out and reinforce your ideas, or I can go out and help you save the world, if you will, or show that the mass murder in Africa is wrong. But why can't I listen to rock and roll? Okay, but how is it that classical music is better for you, if you will, in just a general term, than rock and roll?
Okay, fine. You will get a more adequate answer tomorrow from Helga, who will deal with this related question of the what Schiller dealt with as the aesthetical education of man, which is the role of art in developing the moral sense in thinking. Now, all classical art, as we look back from what we know in modern times, all classical art is based on the principle of reason, not on so-called formal logic, but reason. Is that it always involves what we call the principle of metaphor, which excites those qualities of the mind which agape. Now, you know what happens with rock. The guy gets down there and tries to imitate a mentally deranged chimpanzee or something like that, which is obviously not developing agape. That what we're dealing with today, and the rock phenomenon is a product of it, we're dealing with demoralized people. We're dealing with people who are afflicted by deep cultural pessimism, who have no belief in the goodness of man. And this is a big problem with many Americans. They don't understand that all human beings are born with the essential potential for good. That the human individual is born with an essential potential for good, is not a miserable wretch. They may become one, like Henry Kissinger, for example, but they're not born that way. Even though Henry Kissinger's mother was a nasty person, who one of our people met once on one unfortunate occasion. Nonetheless, he wasn't born that bad. He had to be made that bad. He had to become that. And so the essence of great art is to reach inside the person and to bring forth from within them that within them which is good. It gives them a sense of beauty about themselves and a beauty about life. It uplifts them. Whereas if you get down and start dancing around like a baboon, on a bad day or a bad Saturday afternoon or something, you're not going to do much. But the way to deal with that is to recognize in the friend that the problem here is cultural pessimism. And you find that these moves are going into this kind of phenomenon. Remember what rock is. Rock is a modern revival which was done by British intelligence as a brainwashing operation against the British and American people in particular. It was done in order to bring about what you see in Clockwork Orange, to bring about that state. For example, look back, I often refer to this, Jonathan Swift, the last story of Jonathan Swift on the travel to the land of the hooligans, where you had the horses' rear ends are lording it over 95% of the population, who are a bunch of humanoid-looking, somewhat, called Yahoos. Yahoo being the Confederate mating cry. But these Yahoos who are capable of human speech, who do all the dirty work for the horses' rear ends, and so forth. And the attempt today is to destroy the mind of 95% of the population by these methods and by lack of education, to turn them into Yahoos. Because what Swift was describing, in describing this fictitious place, where the horse's rear ends lorded it over the quasi-human yahoos. He was describing early 18th century England. And that's what we're going back to. So this was a part of a direct destruction of mankind. But the antidote to deal with it, if you can get people to start to sing, and sing in the bel canto mode, they begin to realize they enjoy this. And also they have a better head the next morning than the other way around. But the essential problem here is to recognize that sickness is cultural pessimism. It's the same thing that produced the Nazi phenomenon in Germany. Cultural pessimism. When people become despair, when man becomes a beast to man. And that's what rock is celebrating with chimpanzee-like dances and screams and howls, as in a badly managed zoo, the behavior of a man who is less than man, but a man who says, I'm an ape and I'm proud of it. Because you've taken away from that person, or the society has taken away, hope. For example, what's the normal life? You talk about Generation X. What's the normal life opportunity for the overwhelming majority of people who are classified as Generation X today? What kind of a future do they have under present trends, even without the crash? House, family, very little is misery. It means, well, you know, two people married together, they almost have to marry three people or something to get enough income to support two. Right? There's nothing. What purpose do you have? What kind of a job do you get? What do you do with most of the time of your life? Are you creating something? Or are you washing dishes or hustling parcels for UPS or something like that? What's your mission in life? Who are your friends? What are they doing? The same thing. Where are you going? Where's the nation going? No place. Cultural pessimism. And the basic problem here is not the rock itself. It is a drug in a sense, but it's as much a symptom of a lack of hope. Because people who hope want to find the power to do things. I mean, if you want to become a scientist, you don't want that noise going on around you. You want to have some serenity in your life to concentrate on good things. So I say the two things. You get some from Helga tomorrow, but the basic thing is we have to attack this problem of cultural pessimism, which turns man into a beast to man, and that's what we're fighting against.
Thank you. 1 second.
We're going to take